Hey guys, and welcome back to a new mobile dev news video. In this video, we will talk about the news that are the most relevant for you as a mobile developer from the past month, so from September 2025. I can already say we have some cool changes about Compose Multiplatform. We have changes about a new Kotlin version. Google has answered quite important and critical questions about the new site loading requirements. And there are some cool new Android Studio features. So let's dive right into it. And first of all, Compose Multiplatform version 1.9.0 is now out. In the past mobile dev news episode, I've talked about the Jetpack Compose 1.9.0 version. And now a month after that, this version is also available for Compose Multiplatform. So you can get all those cool new features from Compose 1.9 for the entire software stack after all, for Android, for iOS, for desktop, and even for web. And when talking about web, that is actually also a big part here that has changed with this version 1.9, because Compose Multiplatform for web is now finally in beta. This beta stage JetBrains sees as the stage that aims towards broader adoption of Compose for web, which means really the entire API foundation that you could think of when building web applications is there. That includes being able to use Material 3 UI components to build your websites. It includes adaptive layouts, which is of course super important for building web applications, to have an adaptive layout for mobile, for desktop. It includes browser-based navigation so that you can click back and forward, that you can deep link, that you can have a history of your visited pages. And the way I understood is that all this just works with a normal nav controller API that we already know from normal Jetpack Compose navigation. It also supports system and browser preferences, for example, what kind of system device theme you've set, light or dark theme, and being able to take that theme and apply it to your web page as well. And a new thing in Compose 1.9 is actually interoperability with HTML via the new web element view composable. So this is in the end a composable where you can then integrate or embed HTML content in your Compose hierarchy, which is also very important, for example, if you maybe have some kind of iframe or so that you want to embed in your website, like a Google Maps integration, that you can take this code and actually use it and show it in your Compose hierarchy. That is at least the foundation in the way JetBrains has communicated it themselves. If this is actually something where you say, hey, I would actually like to take a look at Compose for web, I'm of course more than happy to make a video about that, make some kind of introduction. Just let us know below if you would really watch that. However, that's not everything yet for Compose Multiplatform 1.9.0. There are of course also relevant changes for the other platforms that Compose Multiplatform allows you to develop for. On the one hand, and that I think is actually my favorite change here, is that we can finally have preview parameters. We already knew these from the Android side, from Android Compose previews here. I'm in a random project, so if we have this preview annotation, you can see there are lots of different parameters that we could use to change and adapt the preview, like changing the width dp, the height, so the dimensions of our preview, which is quite important if you actually build for tablets and you want to also see that in the preview. That wasn't possible before in the Compose Multiplatform part. You can change the actual font scale setting, so whatever the user has set there, and see how your app behaves and looks as a result of that. Show background and so on. This is, by the way, a native Android project I'm in here, but these parameters now also work for the Compose Multiplatform preview as long as you use this new version 1.9.0. Then another thing that affects the common part of Compose Multiplatform, so in the end all platforms, are finally customizable shadows. So we finally have modifiers like drop shadow, which will really render a true shadow, just the way you may be used to from something like CSS, where the shadow really renders as we would expect. Then a cool iOS-specific thing that Compose Multiplatform 1.9 brings is that you now have more control over iOS performance by being able to control the frame rate. This can, on the one hand, of course, increase performance, but on the other hand, also increase battery life. If you say maybe, hey, that's a screen that is, well, I don't need a super high frame rate, so we may limit this to a little bit lower frame rate. I'm not sure if we can actually apply this on a screen-by-screen basis, or if this is something where we have to say, hey, this is going to be the frame rate limit for the entire app. I haven't played around with it yet, but it is something that is new. And lastly, what Compose Multiplatform 1.9 brings, at least what I consider worth mentioning here in this episode, relates to desktop. Here we now get better window management because we will now be able to configure a window before we can even show it. And that's, I think, something that you typically need, because if you show a window, then you typically know what kind of config that already gets, initially at least. Okay, let's put a check to Compose Multiplatform 1.9 and move to a new Kotlin version, Kotlin 2.2.20. And since this is a version where just the last part of this version, so the 2.0 has changed, it's not a major release. But still, there is one cool thing that I think is worth mentioning here, and that is simply that the Kotlin to Swift export in Kotlin Multiplatform here now becomes the default. And this is in the end what will now allow us stable cross-platform compilation for libraries. So what this feature is really all about is we can have Kotlin code, and initially the way it worked in Kotlin Multiplatform is our Kotlin code had to use Objective-C as kind of a middleman, so to generate Objective-C representations of our code, which is also something that the iOS side understands. And this Objective-C can then be interpreted on the iOS side, could then be embedded in native iOS project in some way in order to also get some sort of Swift code out of that. And this middleman is not necessary anymore. So now with this Kotlin to Swift export feature, as the name says, our Kotlin code can be directly exported as Swift code, which not only sounds cool, but it is really cool because that allows you to write a certain piece of code in Kotlin, export that as a Swift library, so really as a native iOS library, that you could then also use in a real native iOS project that doesn't know anything about Kotlin Multiplatform. So technically, if you really have a pure native iOS project, what you could now do is you could write all your extensions in a separate code base in Kotlin Multiplatform and then just include these extensions in your native iOS project. That would at least be possible here. And with Kotlin 2.2.20, this is now not only the case for iOS, but we really get this stable cross-platform compilation for all these supported platforms. Okay, also check to the new Kotlin version. Let's dive into the next changes in Android Studio, because a new Android Studio feature drop has been released, and I want to show you the coolest new features here. On the one hand, if you work in Android multi-module projects, so here I am in my Runique app, which is the one that I built in my Android Essentials course, where you can see we have lots and lots of different Gradle modules. And if you are in this Android view here, so we have these different views, we can select project, but then, we really see every single file and folder, which can become a bit messy. So sometimes you like to select this Android view where you just get a bit more focused view around all files and folders that matter for Android development. But there's actually a type of file that does matter for Android development a lot that we don't see immediately here in our Android view. We actually have to scroll down to see all of our Gradle files, which has always been a little bit messy. Because if you now say you want to make some kind of change here in analytics presentation, for example, where there is a Gradle file in this folder, which we can also confirm by clicking on project and then actually going to analytics presentation, you can see there's definitely a Gradle file in there, but the Android view doesn't show that. So instead, you have to scroll down completely to the bottom and then search for your Gradle file here in this list of grouped Gradle files. So here it would be. And this hasn't been so ideal, and luckily now we have a way to change that by going to this little menu option here, clicking on Appearance, and then say Display Build Files and Module. And if we check that, you can see in this Android view, we will now see all these Gradle files while still leaving out all the other unrelated files. Now, down here, we still have just one Gradle file which applies to the whole project, but all these module-specific Gradle files we can now see and inspect directly in the modules where we would expect them. Another change that new Android Studio feature drop brings is that your app can actually be scanned for possible Google Play violations, Google Play policy violations. Of course, not for all of them, but there are certain types of policy violations that Android, or Android Studio in this case, could already know of ahead of time and then therefore warn you, hey, it probably wouldn't make sense to release this app as it is because this would be a violation here, this type of policy. Better fix that so you don't get that decline from Google Play. And this would simply be displayed as a typical lint warning. And something that I really, really love here is that we now have resizable compose previews. So let's take a look here in this gradient background preview. By switching to the preview tab, you can see it's loading, but this is how this gradient background we've built in this app looks like. And we now have resizable previews. So we don't even need to define the sizes of our different previews ahead of time, but we can just display one preview and then resize this to see how our UI would really look like on different kinds of screen sizes with just a single preview. And the way this works is here, it won't work by default, but you actually need to switch to this focus view here. So from grid to focus, and then you will see this little resize icon down here. And that is what we can use to just resize the preview and then see how it would look like on a tablet, for example. Or you can also select a different specific device configuration here from this drop-down. And I think that is something that is super, super useful. Cool. Those are also the most important Android Studio changes that I think are worth covering here in this episode. There are, of course, always a few more. But since the point of this mobile dev news format here is really to condense all these news where there's so much happening in the mobile world to just what matters and just what you should take an eye on. I will leave out all the crap that you probably don't need to know about. But lastly, what many of you are probably waiting about, my recent video also got a lot of views about Google site loading and the changes about that. In short, maybe for you again, a very controversial topic in the Android world recently was that Google announced they will stop allowing site loading of Android apps, site loading being a very fancy term here for just installing APKs from unknown sources. We all know this on an Android device. We can go to Google Chrome, we can download an APK and install this as it is on our device. This was always something that made Android quite unique. And now Google says, hey, we don't allow this anymore unless the developer of this APK verifies at Google. If you want to hear the details about that, watch my other video. But now many people actually had lots of questions about how this will work. Will this maybe impact development? Because you will also have to install your development build directly on the device. Does this count as site loading? Do you now have to verify in order to just develop Android app? People had questions. What happens if you just want to distribute to a limited number of people? And these common questions Google has now answered, and I would also like to summarize here. So first of all, will this impact development? It will impact development to some degree. So the good news is you will still be able to just normally develop your Android apps, your Android Studio, install these directly on your device without having to verify your developer account in order to install it on your device and play around with it. That is not necessary according to Google. However, what is necessary and where you have to verify is if you are developing an Android app and you want to distribute that in your team, for example, via Firebase app distribution or some kind of other mechanism. For example, some people also share the APK just with their team. That's also what I often did because it's just so simple. And if you do that, then according to Google, you have to verify at Google in order to allow distributing your APK to your team, which is, I think, insane because it's still not a production build. Another question people had is, what happens if I have an app and I know I only need to distribute that to maybe 20 people because only those 20 people need this app? Do I then also need to verify in order to distribute this app to these 20 people? Well, yes and no. Google says that this can be achieved without developer verification, but you still need some sort of extra account, which they call a limited distribution account. And they also don't specify a clear number to what this limit will be. So whether we're talking about 5 people or 100 people, that's something they didn't mention. So while this doesn't require verification, it still requires this extra hassle of creating an account, which I think doesn't really make our lives easier. If we, for example, just build some kind of internal company app, so just an app that is used for your company's employees also. Those were at least the questions that they answered. Those were also the types of questions that I mostly got under my video. If you want to hear my detailed take on this new site loading requirements and restrictions, watch this video. But this is really a very bad change for the Android world and a very, very Google typical thing to do. Since if you now think, okay, but I just need to verify my account. I don't have anything to hide here. Why is that a problem? Because after verification, you can still let people sideload your app. But the thing is, people aren't upset because they won't be able to verify, but because they have to go through another hurdle to get their app out there, in addition to the already existing 10,000 hurdles that Google puts on us. I'll just say 20 testers policy. People are upset because Google uses the user's security as an excuse for them to get more control. And people are upset because Google slowly takes away all the freedom people have loved from Android over and over again with these small, little, not so bad sounding changes, but over time they really become quite impactful as a whole. And that is what people are upset about. But yeah, for my detailed take on all this new requirements, because this is really something that will matter to every Android developer who also wants to keep doing that in future, watch the video that I will link above here. Other than that, in this video's description, you will also find more advanced Android and Kotlin multi-platform premium courses if you want to really deep dive into these topics. Thanks so much for watching this video. I will see you back in the next one. Have an amazing rest of your week. Bye bye.